Hello everyone, my name is Nathan Johnson. The topic I have for you today is from the Smithsonian Magazine, and more specifically the article Alexander Hamilton's Adultery and Apology. In this presentation I will discuss possibly the most trying time in Alexander Hamilton's life, some of his possible motivations, and the solution to his problem. I will be using quotations of letters written between Hamilton and his mistress, as well as an excerpt from Hamilton's own pamphlet recounting the details of the affair. It began in the summer of 1791. Alexander Hamilton received a visitor. Maria Reynolds, a 23-year-old blonde, came to the Hamiltons' Philadelphia residence to ask for help. Her husband, James Reynolds, had abandoned her. Not that it was a significant loss, for Mr. Reynolds had grossly mistreated her before she left. Hamilton, just 34, was serving as the Secretary of the U.S. Treasury and was himself a New Yorker. She thought that he surely would be able to help her return to the city, where she could resettle among friends and relatives. Hamilton was eager to be of service, but he recounted later that it wasn't possible at the moment of her visit, so he arranged to visit her that evening, money in hand, for her to travel to the city and settle. When he arrived at the Reynolds home, Maria led him into an upstairs bedroom. A conversation followed, at which point Hamilton felt certain that other than money, consolation would be acceptable to Maria Reynolds, and thus began the affair that would put Alexander Hamilton at the front of a long line of American politicians forced to apologize publicly for their private behavior. Hamilton, whose wife and children were vacationing with relatives in Albany, and Maria Reynolds saw each other regularly throughout the summer and fall of 1791, until James Reynolds returned to the scene and instantly saw the profit potential in the situation. December 15th, Hamilton received an urgent note from his mistress. It said, and I quote, "I have not time to tell you the cause of my present troubles, only that Mr. has wrote you this morning, and I know not whether you have got this letter or not, and he has sworn that if you do not answer it, or if he does not see or hear from you today, he will write Miss Hamilton. He has just gone out, and I am alone. I think you had better come here one moment, that you may know the cause, then you will the better know how to act. Oh my God, I feel more for you than myself, and wish I had never been born to give you so much unhappiness. Do not write to him, not a line, but come here soon. Do not send or leave anything in his power." 2 days later, Hamilton received a letter from James Reynolds that accused him of destroying a happy home and proposed a solution. And the letter read, and I quote, "It's true, it's in your power to do a great deal for me, but it is out of your power to do anything that will restore to me my happiness again. For if you should give me all you possess, would not do it. God knows I love the woman, and wish every blessing may attend her. You have been the cause in winning her love, and I don't think I can be reconciled to live with her, when I know I haunt her love. Now, sir, I have considered on the matter seriously. I have this proposal to give me the sum of $1,000, and I will leave the town and take my daughter with me, and go where my friends shan't hear from me, and leave her to yourself to do for her as think proper. I hope you won't think my request in a view of make me satisfied for the injury done for me. There is nothing that you can do to compensate me for that." And I'm sorry, the Old English is really kind of difficult for me to read, but I have a few more quotes, so please stick with me on those. Thank you. So back to it. Rather than leave town, however, James Reynolds allowed the relationship to continue. A pattern was established in which Maria Reynolds would write to Hamilton, entreating him to visit with her while her husband was out of the house. After such tries occurred, James Reynolds would dispatch a request for funds, rather than demand sums comparable to his initial request, which Hamilton paid. He would request $30 or $40, never explicitly mentioning Hamilton's relationship with Maria, but referring often to Hamilton's promise to be a friend to him. James Reynolds, who had become increasingly involved in a dubious plan to purchase on the cheap the pensions and back claims of Revolutionary War soldiers, found himself on the wrong side of the law in November of 1792, and was in prison for committing forgery. Naturally, he called upon his own friend Hamilton, but the latter refused to help him. Reynolds, enraged, got word to Hamilton's Republican rivals that he had information of a sort that could bring down the Federalist hero. James Monroe, accompanied by fellow Congressmen Frederick Mulberry and Abraham Venable, visited Reynolds in jail and his wife at their home, and heard the tale of Alexander Hamilton, seducer and homewrecker, a cad who had practically ordered Reynolds to share his wife's favor. What's more, Reynolds claimed the spectacle scheme in which he had been implicated also involved the Treasury Secretary, omitting where Reynolds regularly requested for money from Hamilton. Political enemies they might have been, but Hamilton was still a respected government official, and so Monroe and Mulberry, in December of 1792, approached him with Reynolds' story. Bearing letters Maria Reynolds claimed he had sent her. Aware of what being implicated in a nefarious financial plot could do to his career, Hamilton admitted that he had had an affair with Maria Reynolds, and that he'd been a fool to allow it, and the extortion, to continue. Satisfied that Hamilton was innocent of any wrongdoing beyond adultery, Monroe and Mulberry agreed to keep what they had learned private, and that, Hamilton thought, was that. However, James Monroe had a secret of his own, though. While he kept Hamilton's affair from the public, he did make a copy of the letters Maria Reynolds had given him, and sent them to Thomas Jefferson, the Republican clerk of the House of Representatives. John Buckley may also have serendipitously copied them. He would get his comeuppance in June of 1797, when James Calder, The History of the United States for 1796, was published. Calder, a Republican and pro-muckraker, had become privy to the contents of Hamilton's letters to Reynolds. Calder's pamphlet alleged that Hamilton had been guilty of involvement in a spectacle scheme that was more litigious than any moral person could imagine. Calder asserted a drop more or less was not to be perceived. His accusations and access to material relating to the affair left Hamilton in a tight spot. To deny all charges would be easily proven falsehood. The affair with Maria Reynolds could destroy his marriage, not to mention his hard-won social standing. But to be implicated in a financial scandal was to Hamilton simply unthinkable. As Secretary of the Treasury, he had been the architect of early American fiscal policy. To be branded as corrupt would not only end his career, but also threaten the future of the Federalist Party. Left with few other options, Hamilton decided to confess of his indiscretions with Maria Reynolds, and use that confession as proof that on all fronts he had nothing to hide. Hamilton's pamphlet, Observations on Uncertain Documents, had a simple purpose, in telling his side of the story. and offering letters from James and Maria Reynolds for public viewing. He would argue that he had been a victim of an elaborate scam, and that his only real crime had been an irregular and indecent amour. To do this, Hamilton started from the beginning, recounting his original meeting with Maria Reynolds and the trials that followed. The pamphlet included revelations sure to humiliate Elizabeth Hamilton, that he and Maria had brought their affair into the Hamilton family home, and that Hamilton had encouraged his wife to remain in Albany so that he could see Maria without explanation. Still, Hamilton pressed on in his pamphlet, presenting a series of letters from both Reynolds that made Hamilton, renowned for his cleverness, seem positively simple. On May 2nd, 1792, James Reynolds forbid Hamilton from seeing Maria ever again. On June 2nd, Maria wrote to beg Hamilton to return to her. A week after that, James Reynolds asked to borrow $300 more than double the amount he usually asked for. Again, Hamilton obliged. Hamilton, for his part, threw himself at the mercy of the Reading Republic, stating that this confession, if not made without a blush, I cannot be the apologist of any vice, because the odor of passion may have made it mine. I can never cease to condemn myself for the pang which it may inflict. Is a bosom emanating entitled to all my gratitude, fidelity, and love. But that bosom will approve that, even at so great an expense, I should effectively wipe away a more serious stain from a name which is cherished with no less elevation than tenderness. The public, too, I trust, excuse the confession. The necessity of it to my defense against a more heinous charge could alone have extorted from me so painful an indecorum. While airing of his dirty laundry was surely humiliating to Hamilton, it worked. The blackmail letters from Reynolds dispelled any suggestion of Hamilton's involvement in the speculation scheme. Still, Hamilton's reputation was in tatters. Talk of any further political office effectively ceased. So going back to some of his possible motivations, Hamilton had his career and political social standing to consider, as affairs during this time, while quite common, especially among some of the original founders, was still considered taboo and against the kind of religious ideology at the time. So the fact that his affair became public, as well as his access to the nation's finances, kind of made this elaborate scam much greater than it was. So for his career, he understood that he would not be able to work again in any political sense if this information was released. So he was trying his very best to quell any kind of implication or any kind of whistleblowers per se, including Mr. Reynolds or Maria herself. On the other hand, Maria was being pressured by her husband, Mr. Reynolds, to continue the affair with Alexander Hamilton, as I previously stated. This was so he could continue to blackmail Mr. Alexander Hamilton and extort him for more money. There's very little motivation then for Maria Hamilton, other than to not continue to be beat and abandoned by her husband, as was the case, which is why she originally ran to the Hamilton residence. So more than likely it was to prevent any future beatings that Mr. Hamilton would inflict. And Mr. Reynolds would inflict. And then her husband, Mr. Reynolds, was certainly motivated by having the money coming in and receiving those bribes, or receiving payments per se, to not release the story, as well as having a very powerful man like Alexander Hamilton essentially at your beck and call. Was a very profitable situation for Mr. Reynolds, and he kind of felt above reproach, especially when he reached out to Hamilton to be released from prison after the charges of fraud. And then during the after the entire event, Miss Hamilton would actually she would forgive her husband, Alexander Hamilton. However, he would never forgive himself for his misdoings. And Miss Reynolds and Mr. Hamilton would end their affair